So next up, podcast listeners, we have the daily Biden dumpster fire, and boy, is it full. The daily Biden dumpster fire. So good old Joe Biden has decided to pivot away from Afghanistan, which is a disaster. And he's pivoted instead towards the issue of Hurricane Ida. And Hurricane Ida, by the way, is not a hurricane, according to Democrats. It is climate change. So we're not allowed to call it a hurricane. We must call it climate change. Now, of course, hurricanes have been occurring throughout the planet for millennia, but it doesn't matter because even though they occurred long before humans have had any impact on the climate, it's climate change. It's not a hurricane. We can't even have that conversation. So Joe Biden, of course, wants to get rid of emissions caused by electricity, among all other emissions, by the way. Wants to get rid of emissions caused by cars as well. So he goes to New York and he talks about the damage that was caused by the after effects of Hurricane Ida, primarily by the massive amounts of rain. And he decides to use that as an opportunity to say that he wants zero emissions electricity in the United States. Now, the Democrat talking point on this used to be 2040. Then they went 2035. I've heard this before. I've heard some Democrats say that we only have 10 years to live. So maybe it's 2031. Okay, because that would be 10 years away, although they did say that like 5 years ago. Well, Joe Biden has a new idea. He wants zero emissions electricity by, what's the date? You're going to love this. We have that clip, and here it is.
We're going to deal with climate change and have zero emissions, net emissions by 2050. By 2020, make sure all our electricity is zero emissions. We're going to be able to do these things, but we've got to move. We've got to move.
So Joe Biden just said, we want zero electricity emissions by 2020. But it's 2021. So either we've missed the date or he thinks it's 2015 and he's still serving with, of course, that was even before then. He apparently thinks he's still vice president back during the Barack Obama's years. And it's like, we want to get rid of it by 2020. And it just shows you what liars they are, right? Because when you're getting early stages of dementia as a president, because you're pushing 80, the chances are that a lot of truth comes out because you say all the things you're told not to say rather than the things you're supposed to say, which is they keep moving these goalposts, right? It's climate change. No, it's actually a hurricane. It's unprecedented climate change. No, we call that flooding. So we have to, as all humans have done throughout human history, adapt to weather. And we adapt to weather by doing a number of different things. One is by improving infrastructure, improving construction of homes, and also, in some cases, by not living in areas where there are floods. And in Manhattan, to be fair, you have impervious surfaces everywhere. Impervious surfaces are those surfaces, as you know, where water doesn't sink in. Okay, like asphalt, concrete. Well, that's the definition of Manhattan, except for Central Park. And so you have water falling like crazy in Manhattan. It has nowhere to go except to go into the drains. The drains are overwhelmed. So the water finds its way in areas where it hadn't found its way in many, many years. And so in Biden's idea, well, it's climate change rather than the fact that it's weather that is indeed changing. And then the question is, well, do you really think we can control the weather? And that's what Biden was talking about in it literally in Manhattan. He was saying, yes, we can stop. Here's what he said. We can stop climate change. We can't necessarily make it better, but we can stop it from getting worse, is what Biden said. Really? Human beings can stop climate change from getting worse. I would sure like to know a lot of details about that, specifics. I would like to see the scientific papers on this issue of how we're going to stop the weather from getting worse. And how would that be defined? And do we even have the information from weather since the beginning of human? I mean, it's just, the whole thing is ridiculous. But according to Biden, with his usual dumpster fire comments, we're going to get rid of electricity in such a way that there will be zero emissions by 2020, which was last year. But he just said it this year. And so, of course, if you follow Joe Biden, there's no shortage of the dumpster fires that he gives. So we even have a second one for you. This podcast, not just one, but two Biden dumpster fires. This one is, we don't call them tornadoes anymore. So in town hall, a confused Joe Biden doesn't think tornadoes are called tornadoes anymore. As President Biden surveyed the damage done by the remnants of Hurricane Ida in New Jersey and New York on Tuesday, he received a briefing from New Jersey officials on the progress they've made in areas in which they need federal assistance. In the course of this televised discussion, President Biden found himself talking about severe weather in meteorological nomenclature, and it didn't go well. Quote, it's all across the country, the members of Congress, from their colleagues in Congress that, it looks like a tornado. They don't call them that anymore. That hit the crops and wetlands in the middle of the country in Iowa and Nevada. And I mean, it's just across the board. And, as I said, we're in this together. We have that clip. Here it is.
The looks like a tornado. They don't call them that anymore. That hit the crops and wetlands in the middle of the country and Iowa and Nevada. And I mean, it's just across the board. And, as I said, we're in this together.
So this is what you do now as a Democrat politician. You use weather as a way of advancing your agenda on climate change. You don't call it tornadoes because you have to call it climate change. You don't call it hurricanes, it's climate change. You don't call it flooding, it's climate change. And so the article continues in town hall. While it's unclear exactly what the president was trying to say, I would have to agree with you there. Who knows what he just said? It seems he is confusing a derecho that swept across the city of Nevada, Iowa. So there's a city in Iowa called Nevada, Iowa, in August 2020 with not tornadoes that struck the states of Nevada and Iowa. Surely the president knows that Nevada is not in the middle of the country, right? In any case, to clear things up, tornadoes are still tornadoes and derechos are still derechos. Nevada is not in the middle of the country, but Nevada, Iowa is. Predictably, Biden's gaffe drew a quick reaction from meteorologists and residents in the states Biden mentioned as reporters and members of Congress piled on. So Janice Dean, she is a pretty famous meteorologist, and I've seen her in a number of different places, I think primarily Fox News. She says, yes, she tweets out, yes, we can still call them tornadoes. And she continues, he might be confusing tornadoes with derechos, which can look like tornado damage. And then just continued. The Nevada thing threw me off as well, she said. Okay, I'm done. And then Fiscal Therapist wrote, I've lived in Nevada for 32 years, and I just became aware that we are in the middle of the country, have crops and wetlands, and have tornadoes that wipe those out. In Indiana, Jim Banks says, in Indiana, we can call them tornadoes. Did I miss something? And then Ash Short said, what do they call them? Twisters? Vortexes? Wind turbines? And then Matt Vespa, tornadoes no longer exist. Biden stopped them forever. So look, one of the reasons we play these Biden dumpster fires is to demonstrate that he's probably not fit as a result of being in early stages of dementia, maybe even further than that. But in addition to that, it kind of exposes who Democrats really are, because a lot of truth comes out of his mistakes, the mistakes that he makes. Namely, that's very transparent at this point. The Democrats are trying to change and manipulate the English language to call anything associated with weather climate change. And that's very dangerous because you really can't solve a problem by calling it some sort of generic term. So if you have flooding in a specific area and you need to improve the infrastructure, then let's improve the infrastructure so that human habitability can continue and can thrive. If you have an area that is notorious for tornadoes, for example, Tornado Alley as an example, probably not a place I'm going to build a house in. I'm going to be quite frank. If I'm going to live in a place that is notorious for flooding as a result of a hurricane, and it's on the Gulf Coast in particular, I'm going to probably not invest in real estate there. It's certainly not in the area that is the lowest area there that always floods, because obviously there are other areas there that seem to be safe. So it's not the whole city, but certainly significant parts of it. Kind of just makes sense. But we can't really have those conversations if you say, well, it's climate change, so therefore you just got to. It's because Democrats don't want you to live in the countryside. They don't want you to live in certain states. What they want you to do, they want everybody to be terrified, just like they try to terrify us of COVID. And therefore, they want you to live in concentrated cities, because then they get to live in their country estates, of course, or they get to live on Martha's Vineyard. But you, oh no, you better live in an apartment somewhere because of climate change.